I'm Frank Gaffney with the Center for Security Policy. Elections have consequences is a well-known aphorism. It's rarely been more true, I think, than at the moment. We're seeing with the first weeks of the Obama administration a series of initiatives taken by the new president and his team that are likely to have not only far-reaching consequences, but consequences that I believe will be very detrimental to American security. Let me give you a couple of examples. The new president has talked about cutting the defense budget. Mind you, we're in 2 wars, and he's talking about cutting the resources that our military has to have, not only to wage those wars, but to be prepared for the next ones. The Senate Armed Services Committee Chairman Carl Levin has said he wants to cut weapon systems. Cutting weapon systems means our forces are not able to reset what they have been burning through in the wars that are now underway, and they certainly won't have the modernized capabilities that they'll need in the next conflict. What does that mean? What are the consequences of that? It almost certainly means that we will be unready to fight that next war. History teaches us that invites aggression. The costs of those aggressions and what it takes for us to deal with them vastly exceed whatever savings we might realize in the short term. Another example is missile defense. The president has said that he wants to support missile defense only if it works and it's cost effective. Never mind that successive tests have demonstrated that the missile defenses that we've been building and deploying do work, and we need them increasingly. In fact, just recently we saw a long-range ballistic missile launched by the Iranians, one that will almost certainly have the capacity to attack targets not only in Israel but throughout Europe and perhaps far beyond, including in the United States. Carl Levin, again, Senate Armed Services Committee Chairman, has said he would love to cut missile defense. Well, this is not a time to do that. The consequences, particularly, of cutting the so-called third site, the missile defense site that we have agreed with our Czech and Polish allies to deploy in their territories, would be to undermine our allies, those who've gone out on a limb together with us and our NATO partners to provide a defense for Europe. It would embolden, I'm afraid, our enemies, in particular the Russians, who have been trying to prevent this deployment. And it certainly would give a free ride to the Iranians as they seek to threaten and, God forbid, attack others with their ballistic missiles and the nuclear weapons that they surely will put on them shortly. Another example, the Iraq situation. The president came to office on a platform of withdrawing from Iraq within 16 months. He's now been told by his commanders that's ill-advised. They have urged him to stretch out any such redeployment or withdrawal. The danger of failing to do that, of failing to take into account the recommendations of his professional military officers, will be, I'm afraid, to create a vacuum of power in Iraq, one that will almost certainly be filled by Iran, destabilizing the country that we've worked so hard to help get on its feet, namely Iraq, again, emboldening the Iranians, and I'm afraid probably setting the stage for the next regional conflict, one in which I think it likely we will once more find ourselves involved, and involved at great cost. Another problem, the president has embarked on a radical denuclearization program. He's talking about a treaty with the Soviets, the former Soviet Union, perhaps the future Soviet Union, that would reduce to only 500 nuclear weapons deployed on U.S. systems. That would effectively mean that we will have to eliminate the bomber force and the intercontinental ballistic missile force, our land-based missiles, leaving us just with submarine-based missiles. This would be the most radical and I think destabilizing step of disarmament in the history of this country, and it will cost us, I fear, in several different areas. It will probably leave the Russians with nuclear superiority. It may invite the Chinese and perhaps others to seek to become powers comparable to our own. And at the very least, it will cause other countries who rely upon our deterrent, extended deterrent as it's called, to rethink that position and perhaps pursue their own nuclear weapons programs. A proliferation result that is exactly the opposite of what the president seems to want in his pursuit of a global denuclearization outcome, the so-called global zero. Another problem, this president has nominated a woman by the name of Elena Kagan to be the Solicitor General of the United States, the person who is responsible for trying cases in the Supreme Court and deciding which cases are appealed throughout the federal judiciary. This is a woman who's never tried a case in her life. Imagine. Dean of the Harvard Law School, where she fought tooth and tong to prevent the United States from adopting, then ultimately enforcing, something called the Solomon Amendment, which was very simple. It said if you're an academic institution that is going to take federal grant money, you have to allow our military recruiters to go on campus. Elena Kagan wrote an amicus brief opposing the Solomon Amendment when it was tried in the courts. Her position was repudiated unanimously by the Supreme Court. Clearly a radical and extremist view that is incompatible, I believe, with the security of this country. The consequences of Elena Kagan becoming the Solicitor General, to say nothing of perhaps becoming the next Supreme Court nominee if there's a vacancy, will be, I'm afraid, to have the Department of Justice in the service of those who are waging what's known as lawfare against the United States military. We can hardly afford that, again, in time of war. Finally, President Obama has indicated that he intends to try to repeal the law that prohibits homosexuals from serving in the U.S. military. The problem with that repeal is that it will impose upon the men and women in uniform situations in which for sustained periods of time they are forced to live in intimate settings with people who find them sexually attractive. That will break the all-volunteer force as skilled people decide they're not going to stay in the military under those circumstances. We cannot afford to have our armed forces broken in time of war. For all these reasons, we have to be very alert to the consequences of President Obama's initiatives, and more to the point, I think the American people need to discourage those that will obviously constitute real problems and perhaps grave dangers for all of us. Thanks. This is Frank Gaffney for the Center for Security Policy.